Well, Robert, thank you very, very much. That was extraordinarily powerful. That was moving. That was a powerful testament to Senator Helms' leadership. And I am humbled to be able to join with each of you in working to continue that leadership, to join with Senator Jim DeMint, who is truly another warrior who followed in the footsteps of Jesse Helms, and in particular was willing and is willing to endure the ridicule of those who will quickly tell you are his intellectual betters while speaking the truth. And you know, Heritage has a long and wonderful tradition of speaking the truth when our so-called intellectual betters would rather not be bothered with it. So I am so grateful to be here. I am grateful that each of you are here, and I'm grateful for the Heritage Foundation. Today, as all of us know, is September 11th. 12 years ago, some of you all in the front row may not as clearly remember it as some of the rest of us. But for many of the people in this room, we'll never forget where we were on September 11th, 2001. My wife Heidi and I were here living in Washington. We were newlyweds, and we were working in the Bush administration. And actually, Heidi was in the White House, the U.S. Trade Representative's office, the morning of 9/11. When the first plane hit the first tower in New York, the Secret Service came through the White House and told everyone, stay where you are. We don't know what's happened, but stay right where you are. Shortly thereafter, the second plane hit. The Secret Service began sprinting down the hallways, saying, get out now. Run, don't walk. So Heidi ran out of the White House. She couldn't get your car because your car was parked in a garage. They wouldn't let you get the car. So Heidi proceeded to pull off her heels and to walk home to Virginia in her bare feet across Memorial Bridge. We lived just south of the Pentagon in Pentagon City, where you could smell the ash and the smoke from that tragic attack. Cell phones weren't working that well, so we didn't know exactly what was happening with each other. But, you know, I'm reminded a dear friend of ours, and a dear friend of many of the people in this room, was Barbara Olson. As we all know, Barbara was on the plane that ultimately hit the Pentagon, and she managed on her cell phone to call her husband, Ted Olson, and to connect with Ted. He was at the Department of Justice as the U.S. Solicitor General, and she was on the phone with him when that plane struck the Pentagon. And her last words, as we understand it, were, Ted, what can we do to stop him? Which, for those of us who knew Barbara, was exactly who she was and what she would be saying and wanting to do. I remember the next night, Heidi and I did what so many Americans did, which is we invited friends over for a prayer vigil. And it was an ecumenical prayer vigil. We had friends from different faiths, Christians and Jews. We read scriptures. We sang, and we just prayed for our nation. It was a moment of extraordinary clarity, extraordinary unity for this nation. Now, in the 12 years since, they have decided that the American people shouldn't watch images of that day anymore. That those images are too disturbing to appear on television. But, you know, that day, you know, it's interesting to remember before that day, very few people in this room had ever heard the name Osama bin Laden. Very few people in this room knew what Al-Qaeda was. On that day, radical Islamic terrorists declared war on the United States of America. Now, President Obama has told the world that that war is over. With the wind down of hostilities in Iraq, with the drawdown in Afghanistan, that terrorism, Al-Qaeda, is receding. and yet somehow someone didn't tell the terrorists. That war continues. Those attacks continue. We saw in my home state of Texas, in Fort Hood, that same evil raise its head and murder 13 American servicemen and servicewomen. And yet, this administration characterizes that murder not as terrorism, but as, quote, workplace violence. That wasn't workplace violence, that was radical Islamic terrorism. And we're not going to stand up and defeat terrorists who would kill us so long as the president remains unwilling even to utter the words radical Islamic terrorist. We saw it again just this last spring up in Boston as two homegrown terrorists used pressure cookers to murder civilians. This threat continues, and we need the clarity to continue to defend the United States of America. You know, I know if Jesse Helms were still with us, he would not shy away from this fight. I'll tell you something, Robert, that I am certain you don't know. The very first political contribution I ever made in my life was to Jesse Helms. When I was a kid, I sent $10 to Jesse Helms. Because they were beating up on him, they were coming after him hard, and I thought it wasn't right. And at the time, my allowance was 50 cents a week. So that was 20 weeks' income. I am willing to venture a guess that I may have been Jesse Helms' single largest donor as a percentage of annual income. But you know, there's another story I heard of Jesse Helms when he first ran. That he opened the mail and out fell a check for $5,000 from John Wayne. This is apparently a true story. And he looked at this check and he didn't know John Wayne, but you know, I mean, that was the John Wayne. You know, the address was California, so he decided he was going to call him and thank him for this. So he spent some time trying to track down. It's not easy to figure out how do you call John Wayne, but he managed to figure out how to do so. And he placed the call, and the Duke answered the phone. And apparently Jesse Helms said, you know, Mr. Wayne, this is Jesse Helms. I just wanted to thank you for your tremendous support in this race. Apparently John Wayne said, who? And he said, well Jesse Helms, I'm running for Senate in North Carolina. And apparently Wayne said, oh yeah, you're that guy saying all those crazy things. We need 100 more like you. The willingness to say all those crazy things is a rare, rare characteristic in this town. And you know what? It's every bit as true now as it was then. We need 100 more, like Jesse Helms in the U.S. Senate. Now, the topic of these remarks today is U.S. foreign policy and the role of the United States Senate. And I think the Senate has a powerful role, a role that we have seen directly in the last few weeks, to focus attention on priorities and to listen to the people. And in my view, U.S. foreign policy should be guided by three simple principles. Number one, we should focus directly on protecting U.S. national security and the interest of the United States of America. Number two, we should speak with moral clarity. And number three, we should always fight to win. Those are principles that when the United States has followed, have protected the United States of America. And when we have deviated, when we have embraced, I love the phrase, pie-in-the-sky internationalism, things haven't worked out well. You know, we think of President Ronald Reagan, who had the extraordinary courage to speak the truth, who had the extraordinary courage to describe the Soviet Union as an evil empire, Marxism, Leninism, as a doctrine that would end up discarded on the ash heap of history. And all of the intelligentsia, all of the Democrats, all of the media, although I repeat myself, all collectively, John, I apologize for that, all collectively said, what an ignorant cowboy. What an ignorant, uneducated Philistine. Evil empire. What could possibly be evil about gulags and murdering and torturing your citizens? You're not nearly sophisticated enough to understand the subtlety. I'll confess to that same lack of sophistication. I think evil tyrants are evil tyrants. And yet, you think about the course of modern history, Ronald Reagan managed to do something that is truly extraordinary. Ronald Reagan, arm in arm with Margaret Thatcher and Pope John Paul, won the Cold War without firing a shot. What an extraordinary legacy that is. In the 1970s, if you would have to suggest you could win the Cold War was prima facie evidence of insanity. You'll recall Reagan's explanation of his strategy on the Cold War. He said, it's very simple. We win, they lose. Oh, the Academy was horrified. You can't say such a thing. Winning is so stark. We much prefer détente. I'm pretty sure is a French word for surrender. Our current president won the Nobel Peace Prize. I think for waking up in the morning and brushing his teeth. And I would suggest if you would look the last 100 years, it is hard to find someone who more deserved the Nobel Peace Prize than Ronald Wilson Reagan for winning the Cold War. Now, I want to talk about these principles as they apply to numerous areas of challenge around the world. What does it mean to focus on our national security, our national interest, to speak with moral clarity, and to always fight to win? And, of course, the obvious place to begin is with Syria. All of us have been focused on Syria. And it seems to me, well, let me say at the outset, I want to commend President Obama for two different things. Number one, I want to commend President Obama for listening to the bipartisan calls to submit to the constitutional authority of Congress. That was significant. It was the right thing to do, and I'm glad he did so. And secondly, once the issue came to Congress, that gave the American people a chance to speak up. I'll tell you, I've spent the last 6 weeks traveling the state of Texas, doing town halls, doing roundtables all over the state. It did not matter where in Texas you were. East Texas, West Texas, the Panhandle, down in the Rio Grande Valley. There was almost total unanimity that the United States had no business getting in the middle of a sectarian civil war in Syria. You know, I tell you, our office in the last few weeks has had over 5,000 calls opposing military intervention in Syria. We had roughly 50 in support of it. In fact, the percentage, I believe, was 99.13% of the calls opposed military intervention. Now, how would you apply those principles to Syria? because I think the President's approach managed to violate all three. Let's start with moral clarity. Everyone acknowledges Assad is a brutal tyrant. He has murdered over 100,000 of his citizens. He has displaced millions as refugees. And he's used chemical weapons to gas some 1,400 innocent civilians, including over 400 children. The man is a monster, and he should be universally condemned for doing so. But the principle that U.S. foreign policy, and in particular the use of military force, should key and depend upon U.S. national security. If you listen to President Obama, if you listen to Secretary Kerry's arguments for launching a military strike against Syria, they primarily derive from the need to defend a, quote, international norm, and to send a statement in defense of that international norm. Now, I'm going to suggest to you it is not the job of the men and women of our military to send statements about international norms. It is the job of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine to stand up and defend the United States of America, to kill our enemies and to defend our national security. The objective, the President's objective in Syria was fundamentally wrong because it was directed at this international norm. And that, in turn, the third principle I laid out about always fight to win. Well, if your objective is sending a statement, you're not winning or losing. I mean, a statement is fundamentally a press release. A statement is something that is quite welcome in a university faculty lounge, but is not the appropriate focus of the U.S. military. And so accordingly, we were told by the Secretary of State that our statement, our military response, if it happened, would be unbelievably small. Now, if one were endeavoring to always fight to win, an unbelievably small response would, on its face, be insufficient to do that. But there was no winning. Winning was not the objective. It was simply making a statement in defense of international norms. But not only was the proposed military intervention not, I believe, in defense of U.S. national security, it posed a grave risk of undermining U.S. national security. Why is that? Because even though Assad is a brutal, murderous thug, that doesn't mean his opponents are any better. As of June, of the 9 major rebel groups, up to 7 of them appear to have had significant ties to Al-Qaeda. And if the President's unbelievably tiny and yet somehow not a pinprick attack were actually successful in undermining and weakening the Assad regime, the predictable effect of that could well be enabling the Al-Qaeda, the al-Nusra, Islamic radicals to seize control of that government, and even more worrisome, to seize control of those vast cache of chemical weapons. And I got to tell you, if radical Islamic terrorists seize control of chemical weapons, that poses a grave threat to U.S. national security. And yet, going back to what we were talking about before with respect to Al-Qaeda, with respect to 9/11, with respect to Fort Hood, if the administration is not focused on fighting radical Islamic terrorism, it is likewise not appropriately focused on the grave danger of preventing terrorists from acquiring those weapons, because if Al-Qaeda gets control of those weapons, it is not a leap of the imagination that those chemical weapons would be used to murder thousands or millions of Americans or our allies. The focus was ill-directed. Now, that I would have and still will vote against military force in Syria does not mean that we should do nothing. There are a host of options we can engage in proactively to condemn Assad's murder. Number one, there have been reports that Iraq has been allowing Iran to fly over their airspace and resupply Assad. In my view, we should immediately cancel the $500 million in aid we are sending to Iraq unless and until they cut off air rights for Iran to resupply Assad. Now, that's a simple, direct response that goes directly to Assad. It also goes to Iran, and it is focused on our U.S. national security interest. Beyond that, in my view, the United States should force a vote in the UN Security Council condemning Assad's atrocities. Now, Russia and China will almost surely object. But in my view, we should force them to do so on the world stage, to publicly embrace this murderous tyrant and cast their veto. And then in response, if the touchstone is U.S. national security, we should respond directly with respect to Russia by immediately reinstating the anti-ballistic missile stations in Eastern Europe that at the beginning of the Obama administration they canceled in an effort to appease Russia. And with respect to China, we should immediately approve the sale of F-16s to Taiwan that the administration canceled in order to appease China. Now, these sets of policies all derive from having the objective of defending our national security. If you are focused on U.S. interests, these steps flow naturally. The fundamental failing of this administration's approach to Syria is that it is not focused on U.S. interests. It's focused on defending international norms. And if you don't have an objective, you can't carry it out in a way to ensure that you win, that you satisfy that objective. Let's take Syria's neighbor, Israel. In my view, the United States of America should remain unshakably alongside our vital ally, the nation of Israel. Now, we have right now a strategic partnership with Israel that is often described as aid. I actually think aid is a misnomer for what we're doing with Israel, because it is not, actually, as my national security advisor Victoria Coates observed on the car ride over, it is not like sending foodstuffs to Bora Bora. Rather, our aid to Israel is 100% military, and the United States of America gets an enormous dividend from that strategic partnership. We get an enormous dividend from the intelligence, from the resources, from the alliance on the ground, and it is beneficial to the United States of America to have an ally like Israel that is fighting alongside us in such a perilous part of the world where they are surrounded by terrorists who would do us harm and do them harm. And in my view, when the military aid is renegotiated for Israel, we should give serious consideration to substantially increasing the strategic partnership with the nation of Israel, because it is overwhelmingly in the interest of U.S. national security. And you know, one of the places where you can see that interest is if you look at the nation of Iran. In my view, the prospect of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons capacity is the single gravest national security threat to the United States in the entire world. Why is that? Because Iran, by all appearances, is proceeding full speed towards acquiring nuclear weapons capacity, and if they were to do so, there is an unacceptable danger that they would use that nuclear weapons capacity and use those nuclear weapons against the United States or against our allies. You know, Iran has been funding Hezbollah, carrying out terror acts throughout the world. In Bulgaria, murdering 5 Israeli tourists, creating Hezbollah cells in Latin America to advance Iran's interests. And you know, it's interesting watching the media report on Syria, because they tend to think in two-dimensional terms. You're either for military conflict or against military conflict, and you're either for every military conflict or no military conflict. And that makes sense if you're not focused on what the objective is. So there's been lots of talk about now the dove Barack Obama is suddenly a hawk. And with some amusements, journalists write that some of the more hawkish Republicans are suddenly doves. Well, let me tell you, in my view, President Obama is both too hawkish and too dovish at the same time. Why is that? He is too hawkish, too willing to use U.S. military might in defense of international norms in Syria in a way that is not directed at protecting our national security and could well undermine our national security. That is far too hawkish for the commander-in-chief, in my view. And yet, simultaneously, he is far too dovish when it comes to standing up and defending our national security interest. In my opinion, the President of the United States should stand up and say unequivocally, if Iran continues to proceed towards acquiring nuclear weapons capacity, the U.S. will use overwhelming military force to prevent them from acquiring those weapons. In simple, clear, categorical language. You know, one of the ironies is that the softer a leader is when dealing with enemies of the United States, the more likelihood there is for military conflict. One principle from time immemorial is that bullies and tyrants don't respect weakness or appeasement. The Arab world, appeasement only encourages more violence. It was not an accident that the nation of Iran released our hostages after 444 days, the day Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president. I am a big believer in peace through strength. Because of this administration's ambiguous messages on Iran, I think we have increased the likelihood of military conflict with Iran, because those messages can only have been taken by the mullahs as encouragement that the United States, that the President will be less than vigorous protecting our national security. And that if they do proceed, the result might be an unbelievably tiny strike. That encourages military conflict. We need absolute moral clarity. And you know, lots of folks like to say right now that America is war-weary. And listen, I will readily admit I have no desire whatsoever to send our sons and daughters into harm's way. But that message shouldn't be misunderstood. That doesn't mean that America is at all reluctant to protect our vital national security interest. I'll tell you, just last week I was meeting with soldiers returning from Afghanistan and another group of soldiers heading to Afghanistan, and the answer every one of them said is, we stand ready to defend this nation against any threat anywhere in the world. If the focus is on defending our national security, we will do what it takes. But we're not willing to sacrifice our sons and daughters in defense of an amorphous international norm. Now, if you look across the rest of the world, you look at Russia, you look at China. Russia and China are major players, and right now there are many who are embracing Mr. Putin's offer to resolve everything. Now, if the outcome of this offer is Assad giving up his chemical weapons, then that would be a wonderful outcome that we should celebrate, the world should celebrate. It would be good for everybody. But I will confess my attitude towards Russia is very much reminiscent of Reagan's attitude towards the Soviet Union of trust but verify. If you look at Putin's prior conduct, there is very little reason to have a high level of confidence that this is anything more than a delay tactic or a propaganda tactic. So I encourage the administration to do all we can to use Russia to convince Assad to turn over those chemical weapons. And if it becomes a question of fearing for the survival of the administration, there may be some remote possibility of it happening. But we shouldn't remotely be naive. We shouldn't remotely expect that Russia or China will do anything other than act in their own national interests. And we should understand that you don't deal with nations like Russia and China by embracing arm in arm and singing Kumbaya. The one thing Russia and China understand and respect is strength. Principled strength. And they will act in their own interest, and we may be able to cooperate in specific ways where it is in their interest and our interest to do so. But we shouldn't be for a moment naive that Mr. Putin loves peace and the American way of life. There are additional challenges to consider. We look at our military, the need to modernize our military. I'm going to suggest a simple rule, which is the weapons that our soldiers use should not be older than the young men and women asked to risk their lives using them. We should not be asking 20-year-old privates to carry a 30-year-old machine gun into battle in Afghanistan. We should not be asking 30-year-old Air Force pilots providing close air support for that soldier in Afghanistan to fly a 40-year-old A-10 fighter plane. And we shouldn't be asking 40-year-old National Guard pilots of an Air Force refueling tanker that supports the A-10 that was built in the Eisenhower era. We should be providing tools and supporting the men and women of the military so they can carry out their courageous task of defending the United States of America. Related to that is missile defense. You know, missile defense is a principle that is so powerful when you are a lone superpower, when you are dealing with a proliferation of weapons. And as the lone superpower, there are a great many in the world who seek to put targets on us. And missile defense is the lone technology that provides the potential for real security against rogue nations, against nuclear attack, against chemical attack, against biological attack, against asymmetric attacks that as time goes forward will only become more and more likely. You know, earlier this year I visited Israel twice, in late last year and earlier this year. And one of the things that was striking was seeing the results of the Iron Dome missile defense. They had just been the subject of a massive missile assault. And the Iron Dome missile defense had nearly a 90% success rate knocking out incoming missiles. I have to admit, I was reminded, we just earlier this year had the 30th anniversary of President Reagan's SDI speech. And many of y'all will remember that when President Reagan stood up and argued for Strategic Defense Initiative, it was derided as Star Wars. This is crazy. This is some idea he got out of an old Hollywood movie. In fact, you remember the analogy that they used all the time? This is like trying to hit a bullet with a bullet. Utterly impossible. Don't waste our time. Now, one person who didn't think that was Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev over and over again said, wait, please stop this because we can't keep up with you technologically on this. Mikhail Gorbachev understood the risks of allowing the United States to protect ourselves. But you know, the success of missile defense in Israel underscores the point I made about the strategic partnership we have there. To have an ally that is live testing in hostile conditions missile defense is extraordinarily beneficial to us. In fact, I would encourage everyone, when you get home tonight, go on your computer and Google Iron Dome wedding. What you will find when you Google that is video from a wedding that was happening in Israel. And it's a wedding video going on, and in the middle of the wedding, you begin to see rockets cutting through the sky at night. And one rocket comes up, and an Iron Dome missile intercepts it. And another rocket comes up, and another Iron Dome, and it proceeds to be like fireworks, lighting up the sky with the wedding music in the background. It really is stunning. Just watch it, and it's real footage from a wedding that occurred. Missile defense is by its nature not aggressive, not offensive, cannot be used to attack anybody. But we should not embrace a pie-in-the-sky view that there are not those who would seek to murder our citizens, and taking every step we can to put in place strong missile defense is overwhelmingly in our national security interest. Finally, I want to talk about U.S. sovereignty. U.S. sovereignty is a deep passion of mine. I know it is a deep passion of the men and women here. Our current ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, has written that the United States should be willing to give up, quote, a pinch of sovereignty. I will confess I am not persuaded. But that does explain the philosophy in Syria of let's go defend international norms rather than the United States of America. And earlier this year, President Obama, in fact, right after he announced his policy to arm the Syrian rebels, he gave a speech in front of the Brandenburg Gate. Actually, ironically enough, on the east side of the Brandenburg Gate, which I will confess there was a certain fitting irony in that. But his speech did not mention Syria at all, his decision to start arming the rebels and begin injecting us into that sectarian civil war. But he did say, quote, we embrace the common endeavor of humanity. We are not only citizens of America. We are citizens of the world. And with respect to the Cold War, with respect to the Brandenburg Gate, he said, quote, openness won, tolerance won, and freedom won here in Berlin. President, with all respect, that's not true. The United States of America won. And it didn't win by accident. It didn't win by failing to stand up for our principles and our values. It won because we had a president who stood and fought for the United States of America. You know, I'll tell you today, we received on loan from Steve Penley, the wonderful artist, following painting that is now in my office. This painting is actually ginormous. It's something like 7 feet by 12 feet. It is massive. And it is a painting of President Reagan standing in front of the Brandenburg Gate, uttering the most important words any leader has uttered in modern times, where he stood in front of the Brandenburg Gate and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Now, we all know when President Reagan gave that speech, over and over again, his speechwriters, the State Department, edited that line out. No, that's too confrontational. You can't tear down the wall. You can't win. And over again, President Reagan wrote that line back in the speech. As he explained, you don't understand. That line is why I'm giving the speech. That's the sort of leadership on the world stage that we need. That's the sort of leadership precisely the opposite of what we're seeing right now. You know, I want to read you a quote that may strike you as apt. The president lives in the world of make-believe, where mistakes, even very big ones, have no consequence. Disasters are overtaking our nation without any real response from the White House. Who does not feel a growing sense of unease as our allies, facing repeated instances of an amateurish and confused administration, reluctantly conclude that America is unwilling or unable to fulfill its obligations as leader of the free world? Who does not feel rising alarm when the question in any discussion of foreign policy is no longer, should we do something, but instead, do we have the capacity to do anything? Now, those words could have been uttered this week, but they were uttered in 1980 by Ronald Reagan describing the Jimmy Carter administration. When America doesn't lead, the world is a much, much more dangerous place. The last thing I want to share is yet another anecdote about Senator Jesse Helms that Robert Wilkie passed on. And it was when Margaret Thatcher was the newly elected leader of the Conservative Party. She traveled to the United States. And the Labour Party that was then in power refused to allow her access to the British Embassy. And so Senator Jesse Helms opened up his office and said to Lady Thatcher, "You can use my office to meet with conservatives here in the United States." And Robert has told me that one of those conservatives that Margaret Thatcher sat down with in Jesse Helms' office and met for the first time was a gentleman by the name of Ronald Wilson Reagan. To facilitate that introduction, to bring together two leaders who have changed the currents of history, was an extraordinary service. And all of us should be reminded that even when things look dark, they've looked dark before. Things looked dark in 1939. Things looked dark in 1979. Over and over again, when the United States has faced extraordinary threats, domestically or abroad, Americans have risen to the challenge. And I am absolutely convinced that each generation, including ours, will rise to the challenge and do so once again. Thank you.
You still have time for a couple of questions. What I may do is just ask 3 people and let you do one answer. Thank you all for your kind attendance, and of course we thank the Jesse Helms Center for hosting this special fourth lecture in the series. The Senator has agreed to take a few questions, and while we're running a little bit over, we'll still do that. What I'd like to do, we have a microphone that we'll pass to you. If you would be kind enough to introduce yourself. I think I'm going to try something a little different, assuming he can remember what's going on, since he has no notes up here. We'll do 3 quick questions and let him answer then in one total. Let's start over here with Juan.
Hi. I heard you say in your remarks that Assad used chemical weapons against the 1400. Can I press you on that a little bit? There's some conjecture that it wasn't him. It could have been the rebels. Have you seen compelling evidence? Are you 100% sure? How sure are you that he was the source of the chemicals?
Okay, Assad. Question down here and then one here in the middle. Just wait for the, please wait for the microphone.
As a proud North Carolinian, Jesse Helms was my favorite senator, and you are definitely following in his footsteps. We've seen in the Senate a great debate between the folks who are on Rand Paul's side of the debate and those on Lindsey Graham and John McCain's side of the debate. Where do you reconcile that as we go forward heading into 2016 in the next presidential contest?
Assad in the Senate. And one here in the middle. No, he'll get it over just so that they can get it on.
Coming along. Thank you. In your remarks, you mentioned that you commended President Obama for bringing the issue of Syria to the Congress. Do you think this set a precedent for the future for the way the Congress will be involved in decisions about war? And secondly, do you think Congress will at some point here in the future pass a resolution on Syria?
Well, I will note that you're asking me to remember 3 things.
Yes.
And
your governor.
Texas politicians have not had a good record
things.
on that front. But I will do my best.
So will I.
Let's start with Assad. That is a very good question, and I think a very fair question. I have attended the classified briefings that the administration has put on for members of the Senate, for members of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Your question was, have I personally seen compelling evidence that Assad personally knew about the use of chemical weapons? The answer to that is no, I have not. I have been told by senior administration officials that their level of certainty is essentially total that Assad used it. But I have not directly seen the intelligence that forms the foundation for that assessment. But I think your question raises a very good point, that we should always be skeptical of intelligence when it comes in. Even the best intelligence is clouded by the fog of war. And we all remember Iraq and the intelligence of their maintaining huge deposits of WMDs. And I didn't see that intelligence either. I wasn't serving at the time. But I will note that it must have been pretty compelling because it convinced, among others, John Kerry, Joe Biden, and Hillary Clinton all to vote to authorize military force against Saddam Hussein to stop those weapons of mass destruction. So your point is a very good one, that even though the evidence appears incontrovertible that chemical weapons were used, I am told that it is clear Assad used it, but I have not directly seen that intelligence. I am taking the word for it, and I don't have reason to doubt the veracity of the administration officials who are stating that. I believe they're acting in good faith, so I don't have reason to doubt the veracity, but I haven't personally seen the intelligence that's the predicate for that assessment. Let me take next the question over here. There are wide ranges of views on foreign policy in the U.S. Senate. And I think you're right that you've got John McCain and Lindsey Graham on one side, you've got Rand Paul on the other. I will confess, at least personally, I consider myself somewhere in between those two poles. Rand is a close friend whom I like, whom I respect. He and I have been allies fighting side by side on virtually everything. And I think Rand is fearless, which, going back to the Jesse Helms point, is a rare, rare characteristic in a leader. John McCain and Lindsey Graham. John McCain is a national hero. He spent 5 years languishing in a prison camp in Vietnam, undergoing unimaginable torture. And in particular, John McCain had the opportunity given to him to go home early. And he turned that down. Now look, I have never been in prison. I've never been tortured. I suspect few, if any of us here have. All of us, I imagine, would like to think that if we were in the circumstances John McCain was, and we were offered the chance to go home early, that we too would be courageous and principled and do the right thing. But I would suggest that none of us, until we've been in that prison, know for sure what we would do. And so I respect and admire John McCain immensely. And he is passionate on issues of foreign policy. In my view, there is a balance that I would characterize as somewhere in the middle, and that balance is very much the views of Ronald Reagan's, which I think likewise are the views of most Americans. So I agree with Rand Paul that we should not intervene militarily in Syria, because it's not in defense of our U.S. national security interest. But I also agree with John McCain that if Iran is on the verge of acquiring nuclear weapons, that we should intervene militarily to prevent it from acquiring those weapons. Why? Because it is in the vital national security interest of the United States. And the alternative is unacceptable. Having radical Islamists with nuclear weapons that could murder millions in New York or Los Angeles or London or Tel Aviv is absolutely unacceptable. And when it comes to defending national security, I don't think we should hesitate at all to use military force. But it has to be tied to that objective. Syria was not. The last question concerned the precedent of sending this issue to Congress. You know, for centuries, we have debated the balance between Article 1 and Article 2 when it comes to war making. Article 1 gives Congress the power to declare war. Article 2 of the Constitution makes the President the Commander-in-Chief of our armed forces. And those two have been in tension from the beginning. You can go back to the very first Congresses with Congress asserting its authority over the power of war and the President pressing back. And I suspect that tension will continue for centuries to come. It is notable that the Constitution uses the word declare war and not make war. An earlier draft of the Constitution used the word make, and that was taken out in the drafting. If you read the debates on ratification, there was viewed as a distinction. What is clear is when there is a direct and imminent threat, when there is an attack on the United States, the President as Commander-in-Chief has the authority to respond as Commander-in-Chief and defend this nation. Very few dispute that proposition. The line between that point and congressional authority is subject to considerable debate. In my view, the President made the right decision here because there was no exigency. There was no need for immediate unilateral action. And it is appropriate both constitutionally and prudentially to submit it to Congress and to the people. If you are going to engage in military action, the path to winning involves unifying the American people. You know, it's notable that in both Afghanistan and Iraq, George W. Bush sought and received the approval of Congress. And getting the enthusiastic support of the American people is critically important to successfully prevailing in a military action. You know, when President Obama announced his policy of arming the Syrian rebels, one of the things that I said on the floor of the Senate, I articulated two principles that I had real problems with what he was doing back in June, arming the Syrian rebels. I said, number one, given that 7 of the 9 major groups appear to be affiliated in some way with Al-Qaeda, as the simplest baseline, we should not be giving weapons to people who hate us. We should not be giving weapons to people who want to kill us. And it is incumbent on President Obama to explain to Congress, to explain to the American people how precisely they're going to distinguish from what they would call the good rebels from the bad rebels. To make a credible case that there is some way to deliver weapons that won't be arming radical Islamist terrorists, that won't be finding us on the receiving end of anti-tank missiles that we gave al-Qaeda terrorists. The second point is that policy was announced, if you'll remember, by a deputy-level staffer in the White House. And in my view, the President of the United States owes the American people more. The President is going to do it. It is incumbent on the President to do what he did last night, to come before the American people, to come before Congress, and to say, I believe this is in the national security interest of the United States, and I should do so. And here's why, and here's how, and here's the path to success. Here's how it's in our national security interest, and here is how we are going to win. Now, in this instance, if Congress had voted down, or if Congress does vote down, the use of military force, I believe it would exceed the President's constitutional authority to go forward with the attack anyway. The President has suggested he would have the authority to do so anyway. Now, why is that? Because I don't think that falls in the gray area where there are some difficult questions of the line between imminence or not. You know, Justice Robert Jackson in the steel seizure case, dealing with Harry Truman's seizure of steel plants, described 3 levels of federal authority, described how the President's authority is at its highest point when he is operating pursuant to an express grant of authority from Congress. And it is at its very lowest ebb when Congress has affirmatively rejected his authority. And if Congress were to vote down an authorization on the use of military force, I think the President would be operating from his lowest ebb of authority. And beyond that, the residuum of unilateral authority in the President as Commander-in-Chief is dependent upon an imminent threat. And President Obama has explicitly and repeatedly stated there is no imminent threat in Syria. And given that express admission, I believe it'd be contrary to the Constitution for him to defy the views of Congress and the people, and I don't believe he's going to do that. At the end of the day, I think this process actually operated the way it should, and again, I will commend President Obama for listening to the views of the American people, for calling off the vote. I think it was better not to vote. Rather than, I think if there had been a vote, it appeared clear that the President would have been rejected overwhelmingly. And I think it is better for the presidency, better for the country not to have that vote occur. I would have voted no. A great many others would have voted no. But I think it reflected a wise and prudent judgment on the part of the President to postpone the vote rather than have that authority rejected. And I don't believe that the President is going to ignore the views of the American people and launch this attack. Once again, I want to thank each of you for being here. God bless you.
Thank you. Pass the test.